So, hello, welcome to everyone online and here in the room. Thank you for joining us. I think we have some 30 or 40 online visitors who have been registered. This is our fourth evening in the Living Science series, a project supported by the Austrian Science Fund. Tonight's topic is Sonophagia, the biopolitics of eating sound. I would like to extend my thanks to the interdisciplinary lab of the University of Applied Arts for hosting the event, which is both a Leonardo Art and Science evening and a part of Vienna Art Week. Above all, I would like to thank our 8 speakers, and I would like to thank Jens Hauser, who will be moderating the evening.
Yeah, I'm in turn also grateful to be invited as a moderator to this extremely rich and dense evening, and I will limit myself to some introductory remarks to facilitating the transition and exchange between the contributors from so different fields and to a humble reflection on the notions of individual versus collective, based on the concept of the whole or beyond, and on the exhibition Life as Other, Life is Other, that has been equally been staged here at the Interdisciplinary Lab at the University of Applied Arts 2 years ago. So first and foremost, I want to pick up some of the notions and key concepts that Klaus Spiess has put at the center of tonight's laser talk when carefully curating this program. We have some flatulating sounds behind. We're coming back to this later. Klaus, can you disclose a little bit why we hear this?
No, it's just about sound and digestion or vocalization by digestion, and it's a project of a friend of Jens, Eduardo Kratz, and Jens will explain it.
Yeah, we will come back to this later, so we keep the flatulence a little bit aside for the moment. The neologism Sonophagia has been coined in order to reflect on artistic and anthropological approaches to what can be called sound cannibalism, in order to serve as a guiding principle for the most various aesthetic and theoretical contributions, including but not limited to sound studies, cultural studies, and post-colonial aesthetics. And anthropophagy, a concept taken from Brazilian avant-garde known through Oswald de Andrade's Anthropophagic Manifesto from 1928, is applied across various fields, covering phenomena in biology, such as, let's say, symbiogenesis or holobiont theory, where eukaryotic cells consume, so to say, or include, absorb other prokaryotic cells across evolution. It can be applied to linguistics, to AI, where languages or models consume each other, or more broadly from forms of artistic and cultural appropriation as such. So my personal understanding is that very schematically, Sonophagia in this event addresses 3 major key issues. First, we're talking, of course, from the perspective of art, beyond the human, beyond metaphor, just metaphor. Maybe this is why we heard flatulating metabolic sounds, and also beyond visiocentrism, bouncing all back to the level of image analysis. So we are obviously interested in notions of art beyond visiocentrism. Second, this evening is much about anthropophagy as a method, and also appropriation as its core problematics. So this means that our entry points are resolutionally transdisciplinary artistic practices that, for example, explore how microbes feed on certain human sound frequencies, how language parasites become spoken, or how material effects rather than the meaning of sound are used in both technoscience and biosemiotics inspired art forms. So we'll see in many of these cases biomedia art as a kind of incarnated self-portraiture, It is unfolding as a self-fulfilling prophecy of the individual self on the one side being questioned, and on the other side challenged by or absorbed by collective forms of otherness. So Sonophagia the title is inspired, as we see here, by Osvaldo de Andrade's Anthropophagic Manifesto from 1928 that serves as a method to link our speakers' interventions, discussions, the ways that alterity, the other in whatever kind, is addressed, embodied, sung or spoken in words, in songs, hereby also de-hierarchizing the existence of different species. And third, the broader vision therefore concerns the politics of appropriation, both in an anthropological and cultural and in a post-anthropocentric sense, and which parameters and sonic and not only semantic regimes play a role on that. So Klaus had some very interesting ideas put together, and I would like to ask you in how far the interventions of this evening reflect a broader research pattern that you are pursuing to your actual artistic research project.
So my professional background is in psychosomatic medicine, and my daily clinical routine reminds me of a politically outdated but still challenging anecdote by Levi Strauss from 1972, which is also cited by Eduardo Viveiros de Castro in Cannibal Metaphysics. I have added the matter of the voice to the anecdote. The arrival of the Spaniards in the Americas, driven by their Christian and colonial assumptions, marked the beginning of an encounter between two radically different worldviews. The colonizers sought to measure whether the indigenous people possessed a voice that would signify their human identity in the Western sense, a voice distinct from mere physical needs, one capable of rational thought, transcending animalistic communication. But the indigenous people, with their own cosmological beliefs, posed their own test. They submerged the Europeans in water to see if their voices would continue to resonate, even when their bodies were physically constrained or decaying. For the indigenous people, the question was not whether the Europeans could speak, but whether their voices were real, whether they were true physical encounters or hollow echoes of faked bodies. In contemporary discourse, the early quasi-philosophical exploration extends into the biological realm. The best example is the human microbiome, a vast ecosystem of microorganisms inhabiting the human body that outnumber human cells and shape human anxiety and depression. It is part of both the body and the environment, revealing many new models about how porous and interconnected the boundaries between speech, thoughts, bodies, collectives, and non-humans are. Today's evening, inspired by a relational understanding of human identity, explores the intersections of voice, identity, and the more than human through a range of anthropological, artistic, and philosophical lenses. Each presentation today challenges traditional understandings of voice and identity, often in provocative, sometimes violent ways. Ana Maria Ochoa deconstructs speech as anthropotechnics, revealing how the uniqueness of the human voice in Amerindian cosmologies dissolves through communication with animals into a process of vocal digestion. Jens Hauser will reflect on how art beyond human agency appropriates and dissolves human agency. Matthias Lewy explores how the human voice becomes singular only when heard through the vocal perspective of the other. Emanuel Gollob and I submerge a tenor while his salivary bacteria feed on Massenet's stream aria. He is singing, reinterpreting Werner Herzog's Fitzcarraldo. Melanie Strasser interrogates the violence in translating Shakespeare into an Amazonian language, uncovering the colonial and post-colonial histories embedded in the act of anthropophagic translation. Theresa Schubert consumes and digests cells grown from her own muscles and gives them back her vocal identity, while Svenja Kratz amplifies the breath of commodified cancer cells. Both artists exploring the sound of bodies they have been appropriating. Jean Braune considers parasites infiltrating and transforming human language, while Tristam Adams reflects on the strangulation of voices in the face of accelerated capitalism. All contributions invite us to listen to the challenges and transformations accompanying the question of to what extent the voice appropriates or is appropriated.
It's worth noting that, of course, the composition of this evening also echoes the artistic research process that you and Emanuel Gollob will also reflect on and elaborate on later this evening. And this project that has recently led to your performative installation, Anthropophagic Myth, Biopiracy and the Opera in the Amazon, at the Ars Electronica Festival in Linz last September, inspired precisely by this anthropophagic myth from the Amazon. And here, vibrations, as we will have a closer look at, from the singing activity of a tenor is adjusted to the needs of a microbial colony, which is then stimulated via vibration by the tenor singer's voice, the altered sounds being in turn played through a phonograph and meant to increase the diversity of the species. You mentioned already Theresa Schubert's piece, also the dimension of sound in Meet Me. Not only autoanthropophagy is literally performed, physically, metabolically, but also the sound plays an important role here. And this is also the case in Svenja Kratz, bone breath. Sorry, I have here. Where bone tissue is transformed into an artistic sculpture through sound. So, as often in public presentations, we first tend to satisfy the visiocentric animal in us and see to the charm of pervasive PowerPointerization, and we have no exception here, unfortunately, as a gesture of hypercompensation, and even the more that a lot of the work's essence is happening at scales we do not see. I therefore want to start with a widely overlooked passage in Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's Thousand Plateaus, where, interestingly, they reflect on the creation of membranes by sound and delineate principles for performing the liminal through sound. It's a text entitled 1837. On the refrain, they describe the formation of dynamic milieus through the creation of functional rhythms to escape chaos and to create provisional boundaries. That means milieus that are reopened once stability is achieved. So that takes the example of a child simply walking in the forest, and of a child who quells in the fear of the dark through song, and thus creates, by singing, this reassuring space, this membrane, this acoustic membrane. And they say home, as a kind of ontological category, doesn't pre-exist. It was necessary to draw a circle around the uncertain and fragile center, to organize a limited space. And it's thanks to this protective sound skin that the forces of chaos are kept outside as much as possible, and the interior space protects the germinal forces of a task to fulfill and deed to do, before the natural impulse to open recurs, and one opens up the circle, a crack, opens it all the way, lets someone in and calls someone, or else goes one itself, launches forth. So here too the membrane is not passive but active through sound. So the principle of self-organization through these fluctuating milieus as a general model of the living as such by vibration. And vibration plays a large role in their theory. And they further write, every milieu is vibratory. In other words, a block of space-time constituted by the periodic repetition of the component. Thus, the living thing has an exterior milieu of materials, an interior milieu of composing elements and composed substances, an intermediary milieu of membranes and limits, and in the next milieu of energy sources and actions, perceptions. So it's interesting that they carry through this metaphor through vibration and sound. So sound, sounds, and vibration in their material aspect more than their metaphoric or semantic ones have a history also in BioMedia artworks in which the media archaeologist in me is also interested. So as early as from 1999 on, Adam Zaretsky, for example, in collaboration with the Tissue Culture and Art Project, conceived of dynamic seeding musical bioreactors, exploring the effects of music on bacterial development. So in order to potentially improve the growth, together with Symbiotica, of pig cells, they decided to play pig music to pig wings. And to this end, they downloaded all the possible sounds from an illegal MP3 source at the time that was Napster, from Pink Floyd, Pigs on the Wings, Black Sabbath, The Fascist Pig by Suicidal Tendencies, and so on. Of course, what is happening here, that there's a kind of irony that lies in the fact that we are downgrading the dimension of the semantic dominance while trying to getting cells deep into the porous polymer constructed by these vibrations of music to assist in the distribution and the physical embedding of the cells. So it's an alteration of sculptural morphology that was noticed as the wings shapes curled up like fried popcorn chips in the first song. So it's a kind of morphological change that occurred. Also in an installation called MMM, Macro Micro Music Massage, or Massage, according to McLuhan, the medium is a message and the massage at the same time. The public was here invited to join in the sonic performance for the cell cultures, meanwhile messaging one's own living tissues or organisms by vocally vibrating each other's three ends with two butt wipe lounge recliners placed face each other in the room. So we see there's vibration, there's erotism, and there's subversion in the terms of how aesthetic quality here is achieved. The group mentioned earlier Tissue Culture and Art Project also proceeded in seeding cells, also with bioreactors and vibration, of course, in subsequent art pieces such as Disembodied Cuisine, which is conceptually picked up by Theresa Schubert's piece that we are going to talk about later, but also a piece called Victimless Leather, also about incorporating the victim as other, but also which has history in this kind of realm. So sound as a kind of component in biomedia art is also predominant in cells, a piece by Guy Benari, where neural cells are cultured, a kind of rock star in a petri dish. When it comes to actually performing this piece, where the performativity of the nerve cells meets the real performer on stage. So performativity and performance actually get merged. But to address these issues of art and poetry that is not semantic, not speech-based, but rather metaphoric, maybe transspecies and erotics or even pornography-based, we, Klaus and I, also have been diving into early projects by Eduardo Katz, for example, his biopoetry, including non-human organisms to create sonic poetry, behavioral poetry, in a time when we have moved in the 1980s after lettrism from poetry, moving away from printed pages to computers to holograms, etc. And Eduardo Katz has since 2002 imagined post-anthropocentric directions for poetry in vitro, using biotechnology and living organisms as a kind of new realm of verbal, paraverbal and non-verbal creation. And the bubbles we saw or heard in the beginning, and I need Klaus back here on stage for a moment as well, because earlier during what Kratz co-initiated between 1980 and 82 in Brazil as a porn art movement, his porn poems performed in squares, beaches, parks, etc., used stigmatizing words and transformed them into from something denigratory to empowering, much in line with D'Andrade's Anthropophagic Manifesto. So we have chosen to listen to a short excerpt from his flatographic poems, Poemas Flatographos in 1982, in which Kratz uses the flatus as a compositional unit and the flatal flow as artistic material. And these flatographic poems have visual scores, but also result in metabolic performances with gaseous explosiveness and scatological resonance. So let's have a short ear on that. Klaus, do you want to comment a little bit why you felt that this was appropriate for the continuing of the evening?
There's no explanation, it's just fun. I mean, it is experienced by everybody. But if you want a more sophisticated explanation, I mean, Kratz is a Brazilian, and he is speaking about, or it's actually, I was wondering why this connection between digestion and music, or digestion and language, why this is also mentioned by Ana Maria Ochoa in a completely different context, which is not related to the arts. So I was wondering whether there is a connection between what Ana Maria says, that the people, indigenous people are learning to speak together with animals, and she coined this term vocal digestion, and this is what I was interested in.
Yeah, thank you, Klaus. That makes it a little bit clearer. And we have now Ana Maria Ochoa, who is a professor in the Newcomb Department of Music at Tulane University School of the Liberal Arts, and her work is on the histories and of listening and the decolonial. She's also working on sound studies and climate change, and her work is concerned with the relationship between creative industries, literacy, and the sonic in Latin America and the Caribbean. And her book, Orality, I think we have it somewhere.
Yes,
here.
you have it.
Here we go.
Here, okay.
Orality, Listening and Knowledge in 19th Century Colombia was awarded the Alan Merriam Prize by the Society of Ethnomusicology. So Ana Maria's work reflects on music and speech as anthropotechnical practices, as a kind of different zoopolitics, where we move from differentiating between humans and non-humans, and the division between nature, animal as it given, and culture, humanity as it made, also through speech, and in contrast insisting on that indigenous Amazonian cosmologies promote a kind of acoustic non-distinction between humans and non-humans, so that we have a kind of human voices, non-human becoming that requires a very different and radically different approach to alterity. So I hope you're all on spot and online to give her a short welcome and warm welcome when she joins us. Are you there?
Yes, I'm right here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay. So I wish I had heard the introduction to this when I began choosing what I was going to write, because I have since written a paper in Spanish called, I'll read the title and translate it, Política Alimentaria, Ecología de la Sonoridad, y Diseño de Políticas de Vida, una reflexión a partir de Levi-Strauss. It's called Elementary Politics, Ecology of Sound and Design of Politics of Life, a reflection from Levi-Strauss that begins precisely and ends with that passage that was quoted earlier, which has been, of course, a passage that has inspired much work. But I chose a different track because of the somehow the work that had been highlighted is this article on acoustic multilateralism, the value of nature and the nature of music in ecomusicology, and my book, which emerged. That article emerged initially as a critique of a new field proposed by North American ecomusicologists in the United States during the 2014, without any reference to either ethnomusicological or anthropological literature, nor indeed texts and sound studies that problematize the issue of the relation between nature and culture around a sonorous object. I had been invited to participate in this volume on the value of music and was going to indeed write about Levi-Strauss, music, listening, food, and Caribbean anthropology, when I decided that at least I needed to make a reference to the notion of ecomusicology that was then emerging. Let us just say that the whole project only makes a very small appearance at the end. And the text became basically a major critique of, and then several proposals on how to approach ecomusicology. When I wrote this article, I also want to reference that the reason I turned to the Caribbean anthropology, just to maybe create a counterpoint with Anthropophagia, is because it's a major site of the anthropology of food, and because at least since Fernando Ortiz's counterpoint of sugar and tobacco, which was written and published in 1944, the question of the relation between sound and food has been central to the Caribbean, not to mention the whole history of a plantation economy that characterizes the region. And I was very interested in that space. And the place from which Levi-Strauss takes that citation is the Chronicle by Fernández de Oviedo, and that scene takes place in Puerto Rico, in the Caribbean island of Puerto Rico, chronicled by Fernando de Oviedo. So the article I work with goes back to the original Fernando de Oviedo chronicle to explore a comparison between, let's say, the politics of indigenous digestion and the citation of Levi-Strauss. But I want to return for now to my book, Orality, Listening and Knowledge in 19th Century Colombia, a book that in a way can be understood as an archaeology of the concept of orality, O-R-A-L-I-T, in colonial contexts. The research focused on the way that European and Creole elites listened to the voice of Afro-descendants and indigenous peoples in 19th century Colombia. But the book did not begin there. It began as what 20 years ago was called a post-colonial question, and today would be called in Latin America at least a decolonial one, which was the following: how had studies of traditional musics been done in Latin America and the Caribbean, in contrast to the way that I had been taught the history of ethnomusicology in the United States? This question stemmed from the fact that my ethnomusicological training in Colombia while I was growing up had very little or nothing to do with the actual history of the field of ethnomusicology as it was presented to me when I came to do a doctoral degree in the United States. In fact, if I were to articulate what my main preoccupation throughout my whole career has been, it is to explore this disjuncture between what I call an imperialistic way of generating disciplinary formations and study objects as proposing a single genealogical history of a discipline, and therefore a single way of understanding what the object and subject of such a discipline is, versus alternate multiverse ways of conceiving of such histories. What began initially 20 years ago as a decolonial project based on the question of how modes of thinking and researching music were undertaken in Latin America in the early 20th century became eventually a project about how listening to the voice of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in Colombia in the 19th century at a moment of the struggle of Latin American nations against Spain became an anthropotechnology for defining the problematic philosophical question of their juridical personhood. That is, in the 19th century archive, indigenous languages not deemed aesthetically or cognitively viable by these listeners, and therefore studied only for the purposes of religious conversion, and human vocalities that sounded to these European philologists and others, like howling, for example, and did not have a set pitch, were used in determining whether these persons were closer to animals or children than to adults worthy of full citizenship and subject to rights. That is, the ontological status of the voice generated an ontological question of the boundary between humans and animals in a colonial setting, a philosophical question that was then resolved juridically by not granting indigenous or Afro-descendants equal rights of citizenship. This, of course, is a classic of colonial anthropology and of the history of the Americas in themselves, which is the problematic status of, for example, the slave between property and personhood, or the indigenous person between, let's say, nature and culture. Now, the problem of nature, culture, and listening, and the status of personhood, or of a sound object that is the result of emerged from multiple places and not just from Brazilian anthropological theory. So I want to bring in some of the other materials that informed my thinking about this cosmological problematic of how to think of living entities in relation to sound. I'm Colombian in origin, as I have already said, and I grew up between the 1960s and early 2000s in Medellin, a city that was the epicenter of what have been called liberationist ideologies that arose during the 1970s. A fundamental area of such ideologies was that of recasting modes of research amongst indigenous peoples in types of aliences, meant to unsettle the exclusion of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples from the control of their land, their educational processes, their music and languages, and their mode of conceiving what the very notion of research and what entities were involved in research itself. My first engagement with indigenous film was when I was 12 years old, when my piano teacher and neighbor, ethnomusicologist Maria Eugenia Londoño, invited me to be present during an editorial session of video materials that was taking place between her and NASA indigenous musician, researcher, and activist Inocencio Ramos. They were producing materials on Betamax cassettes in order to generate objects in indigenous languages to be used in the indigenous schools that the NASA were then creating after having won the national struggle to be able to teach in their languages in Colombian public schools. It was with Mario Eugenia and Inocencio, among others, that I learned then to understand what would maybe many years later be called decolonial work. Two items were appropriated by the community then as crucial for such educational work: videos and comic books. Both afforded the possibility of flexibility between a politics of translation of content entities and formats of, for example, turning myths into school materials that went beyond the written word. They also afforded a mobility between grades of primary school and between the spoken word and the designed object. Of course, they were having indigenous schools for the first time. They had no materials, so a film had to be used in first grade, second grade, third grade, or however they used it. They were then understood thus as a partial object, which was to be completed by the presence of the indigenous teachers, ritual activities, and other community activities. This was not material meant for outsiders to see. So again, it's there's a double element that appears here, which is how the question of human non-human relations also is bound up with the question of production, of how to determine and how to methodologically approach an object, a sonorous object itself. I have also been collaborating, but not writing about, for the past 20 years with indigenous filmmakers in the Caribbean region of Colombia and the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. And here again, since 1985, the indigenous peoples of Latin America have organized themselves into an association called CLACPI, Consejo Latinoamericano de Cine de los Pueblos Indígenas, Latin American Council of Indigenous Films, with international and national indigenous film festivals. These films, contrary to an earlier phase of production, are made for themselves, for other indigenous groups and for non-indigenous peoples. They then need to mediate between indigenous ontologies, the politics of filmmaking, the historical formatting of cameras and sound recordings, the Western formats of film festivals, and the politics of presenting and filming human and non-human entities to a non-indigenous audience. So the process of production and the films themselves are characterized by a feedback between the politics of how living entities, mountains, birds, participate in filmmaking, along with questions about the status of the object in question itself. What is an indigenous film? How do they incorporate cameras into the mythic world, and what to film and what not to film for outsiders to see? So I was doing this work while I was writing my book. I want to return to the original text. And I did not want to reduce my book to questions about how Westerners listened to indigenous peoples. Based on careful archival work, I also speculated potentially on how indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in what, let's say, we could call our reverse anthropology, also appear with their own modes of articulating their knowledge of sound in the 19th century archive. I wanted to avoid what Viveros de Castro called a doubling of the colonial project. By only focusing on how Westerners listened, we miss out on the potential of historical rethinking how, in my case, indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, and a category that was used in Colombia in the 19th century, free peoples of all colors, listened. It is in the midst of doing such speculative historical work that I engage not only the work of Viveros de Castro and Tania Solzelima, among others, then swirling around the debate about what was then called, wrongly in my view, an ontological turn in anthropology. But such a notion was not informed only by Brazilian anthropological theory. I want to invoke two other, let's say, bodies of work that also went into discussing this notion of digestion of sound. And why I think that the culinary arts and the sound arts in this rethinking of the humanities that we have to do with climate change should actually be disciplines of transformation of matter, which would rest together in a way much more comfortably than the way that music departments are embedded in universities, at least here in the United States today. So the first field is, of course, sound studies. So while I was doing my work, this included scholars such as Jonathan Stearns and his book on the audible past, cultural origins of sound reproduction, in which he explored the role of transformation of the understanding of the ear in the 19th century in the invention of sound objects like the stethoscope or the gramophone. Or works such as that of my music theory colleague, Benjamin Steege, whose work Helmholtz and the Modern Listener, published in 2012, also problematizes how the ear was conceived by Helmholtz and how sound was theorized in relation to how the ear was conceived, and how that led to particular theories of psychoacoustics, perception, and notions of the human. These authors, among others, explored the distributed nature of the sound object between multiple understandings of the human and the non-human ear, the politics of listening, the study of the physics of sound and of the voice, and its relation to theories of perception, and the invention of sound capturing machines and the creation of musical theoretical works. When I speak of multinaturalism, then, I reference such works that explore the distributed and multiple nature of sound between nature and culture, between understandings of the ear, the physics of sound, theories about sonic perception, and their inscription into devices of sound capture. Also, while I was writing the book, I had to teach graduate courses in the history of ethnomusicology and became obsessed with Levi-Strauss. So I did not want to, again, follow the path of much anthropological work in the United States, which was discarding the work of Levi-Strauss then. I had a colleague in anthropology tell me why on earth I was using Levi-Strauss in my classes. It was then that I came across also the work of anthropologist Patrice Manigler, whose 2006 book La vie énigmatique des signes, Saussure et la naissance du structuralisme takes the task of going back to Saussure's archive and doing what he calls rewriting of Saussure by problematizing the relationship between the ontological problem of language and the rise of structuralism. And he was, along with Philippe Descola and others, also rethinking the history of structuralism. So after that, what I have done is I return to that initial problem that sort of appears very minimally in the work that I have just cited, which is that digestion of sound. And since then, many things changed. I lived in Puerto Rico for 3 years, and I focus on the Caribbean because the indigenous peoples I work with are in the Caribbean, and the Caribbean is a central place for the focus of sound. I have then generated 2 spheres of distinctions in which I briefly would like to mention, which is a distinction between digestion and consumption. And I mention consumption because when I lived in Puerto Rico, I was shocked by a type of colonialism promoted by the United States in which the primary item that is negated is food. When Hurricane Maria happened, and I'm almost closing now, and I had a Puerto Rican student who told me, if something happens in Puerto Rico, we only have 2 weeks of food. So the revolution, the decolonial revolution in Puerto Rico has been to plant gardens and retake food options. So I'll leave it at that. I apologize for not developing the digestion aspect so much, but that is, in fact, a dimension that I have developed in work that I did not reference here, but comes afterwards through Caribbean anthropology. And we can talk about that later in comparison to Anthropophagia, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to hook up on something that you said about the difficulty of providing us with products that accurately reflect and represent the importance of the non-human distinction. I mean, how to actually stage and produce products that go in the direction of post-anthropocentrism. I'm thinking of El Abrazo de la Serpiente, of course, also the Colombian film by Chiroguera, where I remember, I mean, not only because it's black and white, so color is being disanthropomorphized in a certain way, and in one way, and then also the scene where Schultes is paddling through the Amazon and carrying his heavy phonograph with Western European opera sounds. Is this an attempt to actually ridiculize, because the indigenous counterpart in this film cannot understand how this kind of conservation of sound through a phonograph can partake of this cosmology that is, of course, based on this non-distinction? How do you see that? Is this part of the difficulties that you're addressing?
Yes. Well, I think that's a body of filmic work that is different to the one I'm proposing. Of course, Cido's work emerged at the same time that is these ethnomusicological films, these indigenous films emerged. So I think the nature of the object of these indigenous films is very different from something like El Abrazo de la Serpiente or, of course, the very problematic film, other film. So first of all, in the first one, there was, I think, not only no intention. Anyway, Manaus itself is, I think, a very complex site of where the film partially takes place, in which you have at the same time this history of an opera house and this site of, let's say, a lot of today CD production. So that these are sites that complicate the idea of an indigenous object. But obviously, that film did not include any indigenous perspective. See, the other film, El Abrazo de la Serpiente, was a film with indigenous actors, but not produced by indigenous filmmakers.
Yeah.
So their form of appropriation, the presence of indigenous persons is very different. in a trip to Leticia, I met the main indigenous actors who is now deceased during the COVID pandemic. But they were training with indigenous, let's say, teachers themselves to act in the film. This body of films I'm talking about, which is a substantial body, I will provide the link to the YouTube page of the indigenous film filmmakers I work with, is a very different problematic. It's a problematic that arises through different forms of collaborations, and that takes different form in different countries. In Bolivia, it took one form, in Brazil another, in Colombia a different one, of how these indigenous peoples become film producers. And what is happening is, on the one hand, a desire to the problem of participating simultaneously in a ritual life and in the institutions of modernity, like the school or art collectives. So those films deal with that mediation between a ritual life, between modes of conceiving of the human and non-human, while at the same time conceiving of these very modernist and working with these modernist objects like a film. So the problematic that presents itself is very different, and is also always a problematic of collaboration, since the films are done between Western and non-Western and indigenous peoples. So yes, there's the status of the object, there's the mode of appropriation, but I'll provide a link to some of these films right now.
Yeah, thanks for making the distinction. I didn't want to confuse the indigenous filmmakers with the film I mentioned, the Embrace of the Serpent, the English title of Abrazo la Serpiente, but thinking of the difficulty of creating such a kind of transitional cultural object that also speaks to another public. That was but thank you for going into details. We have to move on, and we have a very tight schedule, and hopefully the following presentations are also interesting for you. We are moving over more closely to Andrade's manifesto, this Cannibalist manifesto, and to problems of translation. And we have Melanie Strasser here from Vienna, from the university assistant here at the University of Vienna. We studied philosophy and translation studies, and we have her book here, Cultural Cannibalism, Translations of Anthropophagy, that has come out quite recently. And so Melanie is going to talk about the hierarchy between the self and the other, about colonizing and assimilating, based also on translational problems. So in how far this very typical phrase that we know from Andrade's manifesto, to be or not to be, referring to precisely disparate groups of indigenous people from the Amazon, how they would devour European culture, and how by doing that it would assemble a decolonized, unified Brazilian nations. And of course, going back to Shakespeare's To Be and Not to Be and not to be is a kind of play which also goes back to the very back and forth of the anthropophagy as a kind of drive, being first, of course, articulated in the European avant-garde and then incorporated by Brazilian avant-garde. So it's a kind of back and forth of translations. So the ironic adaptation of language to the Tupi people by the Tupi people is something that is on the core of the next presentation, and I think we will dive deeper also in the manifesto as such. So please welcome Melanie Strasser here for her live on-site presentation.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. So I'm going to serve you 8 appetizers, 8 cannibalistic appetizers, just to give you a taste of the phenomenon of anthropophagy, of cannibalism, of the process of devouring, digesting, and transforming the other. So the first one, Cannibalor terra. Cannibalism begins with a border, the border between civilization and barbarism. Cannibals first appear in Christopher Columbus' logbook in 1492. The term stems from a mishearing. Caribe, Cariba, Caniba was the self-designation of a Caribbean indigenous people. and meant strong, brave. The European sailors, who were convinced that they were in Asia, thought they were dealing with subjects of the great Khan, El Gran Khan, and they heard the Latin canis, dog, but also carne, meat, in their name. The so-called New World turns into Cannibalor Terra, the land of the savage man-eaters, waiting for the light of culture. 2. Cannibal manifestations. 374 years after the Portuguese bishop Sardinia was cooked, roasted, and eaten at the northeastern Brazilian shore by fierce members of the indigenous Tupi people, Oswald de Andrade launches his cannibalist manifesto. So we are in the year 1928. The Brazilian modernist movement of anthropophagy is born. Its protagonist is the evil savage. His motto is to devour and no longer be devoured. The modern cannibal bites back. He mixes European cultural goods and art with own ingredients, with own traditions, transforming them into a genuinely Brazilian dish. Anthropophagy affirms and resignifies the colonial attribute of the barbarian man-eater. Anthropophagy is itself a cannibal act. It does what it says. It is what it eats. 3. Cannibal reason. Oswald de Andrade claims for a cannibalistic vaccine, an antidote for the Occidental Western logos that for him is a canned consciousness, that is a limited consciousness, that excludes everything it cannot grasp. Cannibal reason, however, is transgressive. It refuses to conceive a spirit without a body, as it says in the manifesto. So cannibal reason seeks to incorporate what the reason of enlightenment rejects: the mystical, the unconscious, the feminine, madness, joy, nonsense, everything that doesn't make sense, and death. The Cannibalist Manifesto is a rattling of against the great narratives, against the history as told by the victors, against Catholic doctrine, against the European system of sublimations, against messianic culture, against the morality of the stork, against the law of the father and his empire of taboo. The manifesto cries out against memory, against Portuguese grammar, down with Anchieta, against Europe's literary canon, down with Goethe. 4. Happiness. Anthropophagy is an attack on the logic of order and progress, on the serious labor of reason. 2 times we find the same little phrase in the manifesto. Joy is the proof of nines. Joy. It's the interruption in the gears of reason, a remedy against resignation and bitterness. It's a political response. It is Nietzsche's joy in nonsense, happiness without any reason, the worst enemy of totalitarianism. The modern cannibals laugh. Before the Portuguese discovered Brazil, Brazil had discovered happiness. 6. no, 5, sorry. 5. To P or not to P. This is the formula with which Oswald Giandraghi ironically transfers the iconic European Weltschmerz, to be or not to be, into the Brazilian jungle. To P or not to P. Such a small shift of letters, a mishearing, and the pinnacle of European culture, Shakespeare, is transformed into something genuinely Brazilian, into the indigenous Tupi, the incarnation of the cannibal who inhabited the Brazilian coast when the colonizers arrived. It is an example of a translation that will be, decades later, will be known under the label cannibal translation. The cannibal translator does not submit himself under the original. He is not melancholic or nostalgic. He refuses to be invisible. He mishears the original. He hears himself in it. He mixes it with his own cultural flavor. To pee or not to pee. Some people even hear the verb to pee in it and see it as a proof of the cannibal's irreverence. Cannibal translation, a devouring of sounds. The cannibal translator listens more than he reads. Important is not the meaning, the sense, but the body, the materiality, the flesh of the letter. We are concretists, it says in the manifesto, anticipating the movement of concrete poetry that will build poems of sound. 6, utopia. As you can see or hear, anthropophagy is so much more than eating the enemy. It is a critique of reason. It is about hearing what has not been heard. It unsettles. It staggers meanings. It evokes a different society. To be, to be, means to live against what has been praised as our culture. The manifesto says, down with the dressed and oppressed society. The aim of anthropophagy is the matriarchy of Pindorama, the indigenous name for Brazil, a conviviality based upon happiness, sensuality, incorporation instead of exclusion. Anthropophagy evokes utopia, a non-place, a tupi utopia, a utopia. Seven, Semiophagia, eating signs. The cannibal ritual of the Tupi people evokes a whole poetics. Their words too fit to eat, the poet Rosemary Waldrop states. And indeed, the most important part of the cannibal ritual was speaking, not eating. Cannibalism is a speech act, a dialogue, a ceremonial duet. The cannibal and his victim sing, they sing together. The victim sings that he too is a cannibal. He says and sings that his flesh is nothing other than the flesh and blood of his enemy's ancestors. So the victim is the other, and at the same time one's very own self. The roles of the cannibal and his victim blur, or, as Claude Lévi-Strauss states, we are all cannibals. According to the Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, In the complex 2P ritual cannibalism, consuming the flesh of the victim was insignificant. I cite Viveros de Castro, what was eaten was the enemy's relation to those who consumed him. In other words, his condition as enemy. The signs of his alterity, the aim being to reach his alterity as point of view on the self. It's a cannibalism of words. It's a cannibalism of relations. Cannibalism is an eating of signs. What matters is the relation to the other. The cannibal rite is, as Viveros de Castro writes, the great presence of the body, of the voice. The mouth that devours is the mouth that sings. Inside and outside mingle. To kill, to eat, to sing, it all has the same goal, to break down the boundary between the self and the other. Love and hate, death and eros, double metamorphosis, double violence. Every devouring is a self-devouring. And 8, becoming animal, becoming other. There's a story by Clarice Lispector in which the protagonist, who instead of a name carries only 2 letters, finds a cockroach in her bedroom. And in this cockroach, she recognizes her own innermost self, her own core. She eats the cockroach. She eats its white inner mass. Clarice Lispector, I was consuming myself. The boundaries between human and non-human fall apart. It is an experience, as Lispector writes, so much greater than human sense. Going beyond the human, becoming more than human, means that there is nothing but difference. To know, to see, to be means to absorb the point of the view of the other. Becoming animal, becoming jaguar, like the jaguar hunter in João Guimarães Rosa's short story, who transforms into a jaguar, and then his speech crumbles, he stammers, his speech rattles. Language itself turns into a jaguar. It jaguarizes. Cannibalism is a transgression of signs, of sounds. It's the desire of the self to be no self, to be more than one self. And this is the deep meaning, or maybe the abyss of the cannibal ritual, speaking other, becoming other. And the answer to the question, to pee or not to pee, is maybe to pee and not to pee, to pee, two PIs. Yeah, thank you.
Maybe just one short question. Is it all about deconstructing binaries then? Because we find this 2p and not 2p also, let's say, also in Western attempts to, for example, including the Baroque, abolishing binaries differences, and it comes down to this misunderstanding, which is phonetic in the first place. In how far do you think that why we feel today that this manifesto for us, this kind of post-colonial studies, is a good lesson?
Thank you for the question. I have my of course, anthropophagy has been seen in this decolonial discourse also. I think it's important today to see the modernist anthropophagic movement including the indigenous perspective. So in Brazil, for example, you have now a movement which is called re-anthropophagy, and it's an indigenous answer to the modernist movement of anthropophagy. Because, as you might have noticed, during modernism or in the Cannibalist Manifesto, the indigenous is also exoticized and stereotyped, right? And it is a projection for the modernist goals in general. So I think today, and to really have a decolonial and ethical perspective, it's important to include the view of the other. And yeah.
Okay. That was a very precise and short answer, which allows us to moving directly to, Klaus and Emanuel's project, which is very much based, I think, on these very issues that you brilliantly summarized in 8 points. Thank you so much. And I think, okay, we take the question from the audience, please. How we can do that? Okay. So, the question from the audience. I'm curious how you got into Clarice Lispector's book. I got there too because of a talk by Vivian giving it at SESC in Brazil a few years ago, especially talking about the Amerindian perspectivism. I was wondering if you got there through the same route too, and if you have anything to comment about the relation between anthropophagy and perspectivism. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. This is not easy to answer shortly, I guess. It's all this huge decolonial project in anthropology to try to include this this different view on anthropophagy, as I have tried to sum it up, to include it in this decolonial project and to think it together with perspectivism. I could not talk about perspectivism in my talk, but as you might know, perspectivism and cannibal alterity, as Vivian calls it, have a very close relationship to each other. So Viveros de Castro even says that perspectivism is some kind of anthropophagy, under new terms, and I would say that these new terms is this rethinking of anthropophagy today, including the indigenous voice.
So we hope we answered this question. Is there any question in the room that is pressing and urgent? If there's not, we are moving forward and have a perfect transition to Emanuel Gollob's and Klaus Spiess' artwork, precisely based on this Amazonic kind of reenacting, including re-enrichment of microbial cultures shown recently at Ars Electronica. I will introduce Klaus Spiess, of course, as himself, having introduced himself as the Director of the Art and Science program here at the Vienna Medical University and an associate professor, having been developing hybrid biological performances since years, and Emanuel Gollob as an artist and researcher with a particular interest and focus on the performativity of human-robot interactions and AI. And we are going to hear reflections on the performance Chronolalia, which deals with vocal vibrations, where the vibrations become the medium through which the oral microbiome it's actually enhanced for its own growth. And there is also questions of othering that we are dealing with, as we have heard before. And the audience also accessing this strange part of the voice, this kind of polyphonic hybrid chorus that is a kind of formation of a more than human entity. So let's hear more by Emanuel.
Thank you, Jens, for the introduction. Today I'm going to present two projects. One of them is Chronolalia and the other one is Eating Caruso. Both of them were created in the framework of the artistic research project Semiotic Symbiosis for the Post-Human Commons, led by Klaus Spiess. And the two projects were created throughout the last 2 years with a wider team who are also, the two of us were part of this team, as well as Michael is here today, as well as also Merta. I'm going to start with the project Chronolalia, which was presented at the Ars Electronica Festival last year. And I'm going to right away move to the next slide. So the side of the project is our mouth. In our mouth, our human voice and oral microbiota and language meets. And it's a place for negotiating phonetic utterances. It's a negotiation between oral microbiota, our voice intention, as well as environmental and technical factors. To us, voice has a semantic meaning, but to our microbiota, it's an environmental resource. So here in our lab, we exposed microbiota to different frequencies. And the findings were that specifically the tonal and aspects of our human voice enhance the cell growth, are consumed by the microbiota for cell growth of the cytoskeleton. This correlates now that the more alphabetical and noise parts of our voice will lead to cell death within our mouth. In order to not limit our research to our socialized vocal tracts, human vocal tracts, we used a synthetic voice articulator to search for phonemes beyond the International Phonetic Alphabet. What you can see here now is the situation within the space. So we externalized the oral microbiota to a bioreactor in the center of the room. And the audience is invited to bring in their phonetic input. While the phonetic input is brought to the space, it is renegotiated in the space. So therefore we externalize this negotiation of phonetic utterances that's normally happening in the mouth to an open spatial process. And the externalized oral microbiota, as well as the technical system, renegotiate the provided acoustic input. The process or the product of this continuous renegotiation is then echoed back through 5 speakers. And as a result, there's an echo of a polyphonic core where the audience is invited to experience themselves through the others.
Will probably have the most vibrations.
Within the system, we tried to not include a hierarchy, therefore that there is a negotiation where the technical system not overrules the externalized microbiota, or the human input overrules the other contributors to this process. Additionally, the audience, while contributing with their speech input, were standing on a vibrational plate, experiencing how it might feel to be exposed to these frequencies in another scale.
I said, how are you in Chinese? And I just heard the feedback of like a little bit like, how are you? The voice tone, because I do a lot of voice research as well. So it's like, yeah, I heard a little bit like Chinese tone there, like from this one. Yeah. So.
D'habitude, je ne parle pas très fort, mais il va falloir que j'augmente mon volume.
As the next project, I'm going to present you Eating Caruso. We displayed it this year at the Ars Electronica Festival. And it's a project in the context of contemporary exploitation of Amazonian communities. So pharmaceutical companies are traveling to the Amazon in order to exploit or harvest microbial diversity. At the same time, we are facing a decline of a multitude of languages. Specifically also in the Amazon, there are 12 phoneme languages, and they are in the danger of becoming extinct. We connected these two dots with a scene from a prototypical colonial film, Fitzcarraldo, by Werner Herzog. In this specific scene, the main actor, Fitzcarraldo, wants to build up an opera house in the Amazon jungle, and is going there by ship. And when he has the first contact with the Amazonian community, he pulls out a phonograph and exposes them to Western opera. From his point of view, bringing them the culture from the West. Obviously, this is highly critical, and we wanted to counteract this scene. And maybe what I need to add is that the aria that was played on a phonograph is an aria sung by Caruso and an opera by Matthias. We counteracted this by placing our Caruso within a tank of its own saliva. So in the space, you can see the cylinder to the right, and the tenor singer is within his own externalized microbiota. And it appears like he is floating, like he is underwater. And from this point on, we started to deconstruct the aria, the Italian aria, the original aria. As a prerequisite for the project, we started to do another lab experiments and exposed different microbial communities to an Amazonian interpretation of the Italian aria, to a whistled interpretation of the aria, as well as an Italian, the original Italian version of it. And what we found is that in the whistling interpretation of the aria, the diversity of the microbial community was the highest, by far the highest. In the Amerindian or Briaha interpretation of the opera, the growth rate was the highest. And we used this data to then develop a more or less process of how can we mutate this area from one performance to the next one, and how can this mutation happening with the live microbial data from the cylinder, as well as a technical deep learning system that is trained on our lab data. And both of these entities now, microbes as well as the technical aspects together, facilitate a partitur generator, and from one performance to the next one mutates the area depending on the needs of the microbes. So as a result of this process, every time the performance is enacted, there is a partitur generated based on the microbial needs and the technical preferences. And from this point on, now our new Caruso, together with his oral microbiota in the mouth, is reinterpreting or interpreting this partitur. And now I'm gonna share a glimpse of how this was experienceable in the space.
西西多该嘛
Along the needs of the externalized microbiota, in this whole process, it was a task of finding a Creole area that is going in parallel or in synchronicity with the biodiversity of the externalized microbiota. So it was a process of slowly mutating the Italian area away from its origins. Thank you.
I think, unfortunately, we really have to move forward.
As I did some consulting and research for this project that has changed name since I last talked to you, which is really interesting, but that's another story. But what is really interesting about the film that probably lots of people have seen, Fitzcarraldo, is a film of '82. And what is interesting is this particular scene. There is a famous aria, Manon, calling out to Manon. Manon Lescaut, a very famous opera, is being sung after we have heard on the soundtrack off without any image, just the sound, so-called indigenous drums. So they are on this river. They are a little bit afraid of the indigenous peoples. They don't know what they will do to them. And first you hear those drums, but you don't see the indigenous people, so that makes it even more frightening. And then the Kinski character, Fitzcarraldo, really says, and now let Caruso speak, or let him answer. Now, what is so interesting about this scene, you can watch this particular scene on YouTube. You don't need to sit through the whole movie. It's '82, and what you hear are drums from a country in Africa, Burundi, not South American, and if you hear them closely, it's exactly the sound that pop music was exploiting in the early 80s, a particular African drum sound that was particularly exploited in the early 80s. What I really like about it is this wonderful joke. It should be a paradigmatic, ahistorical sound that we are hearing, but it is utterly historical. It has a tiny historical window, as the Caruso aria had, and it is not even the correct continent. So that's a bit of a criticism of Herzog.
With this having in mind, we are continuing with Matthias Lewy. He's a professor at the Lucerne University of Applied Arts in Switzerland. He was previously a lecturer at Humboldt University in Berlin and also in the University of Brasilia. And his PhD focused on musical rituals and indigenous groups at the border region between Venezuela, Brazil, and Guyana. And we will going to hear reflections on what he calls symmetrical auditory attitude found in Amazonian cultures. And something that also Melanie has been pointing out, it's the kind of symmetry and the that signs of the victim's alterity to be assimilated, the state of the other to be consumed. And anthropophagy can only be realized through this kind of sounds, through sung worlds, where killing and singing, as we heard before by Melanie's intervention, are also part of similar practices in the process of becoming others. So please welcome Matthias Lewy if you're online.
Hello everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. I worked like 10 years ago about symmetry auditory anthropology and the symmetrics following Bruno Latour these years. And I would try to make it fast because this is some kind of all the slides and some kind of old representation. Because like 10 years ago, I was thinking about this cannibal metaphysics by Theresa Castro. And in the introduction, I saw that this is a quote from my article, but this refers to Theresa Castro. One must speak of oneself or perspective of the other. So one of two things which is important to say before, we should not generalize indigenous ontologies, and we should beware of appropriation of indigenous ontologies. There are a lot of difference between the Chingu region, where the Tupi lives, and Theresa Castro worked about the Arawete in the 92. And I worked about the Caribbean speakers. We had this by Melanie Strasser, Carib Cannibal, but anyway, this is a huge group. And I worked with the Pemon in the border region between Brazil and Venezuela. I lived there. And one of my main things, or what I did like 10 years ago, is I was talking to the indigenous people, to the specialists, especially to Babina Lambos about the series. So what I did is collective theorizing. So what I did is going to echoing all the theories in the field, because this is important. We cannot build up ontologies and create narratives about indigenous without them. So this is a very important point. And when it comes to this point, I just make this short slide. We talked about that. We have this metaphysics of predation, which is quite famous, who see whom as what and why. So we know that humans will see under normal conditions, see humans as humans, animals as animals, and predator animals and spirits see humans as prey, and prey animals see humans as spirits or predators. This is called the metaphysics of predation. I guess you use it and you know it, everyone. And it has influenced this what Theresa Castro called the multinaturalism, or his versus multiculturalism, which I guess is not very good terms to use, because it's nature and culture, and there's no indigenous terms for that. Anyway, Descola used this interior to physicality. He has this book Beyond Nature and Culture, which I would prefer. My question all the time is, where is sound? And not only voice, where is sound in general located? And what I did, and please do not disseminate this video you're recording. I have some sensitive data here. I don't know which intention is to record that, but I normally do not. I advise everyone it's not for dissemination or to upload in YouTube or for any further use, because we would come to cannibal authority. And what is that? And we had this question: what has multinaturalism and predation to do with cannibal authority? And this is exactly the things that I become the other. I become myself due to the other, not only to the voice. The victim is not singing with the predator, the winner, or who wants to kill the other one. He dreams before, and then the song comes to him, and then he kills the one, and then he sings a song, and all people hear this song, which means that we have different seeing in a way, but we have similar hearing, because every spirit, every godness, everyone can hear the same thing. That's why I had once, I argue once, like 2012, that a different seeing but similar hearing, because sound has another function. And I will give some clear, I was thinking to give you some ethnographic, how do you say, examples to realize what we talk about when you say about the voice and cannibalism. But there's something, what Melanie said, is something true in it. For the Caribs, for the Arawete, maybe, I do not know, as I work with Caribbeans. And I once talked to Babina Lambos, who is a 65-year-old woman, about perspectivism. She once asked me what I want to know, and I explained to her all this series and who said what and why. And she told me that things are quite complicated. So it's more complicated. We cannot say that this is such the easy way as the metaphysics of predation works. So she gave me this example that we have, for instance, a jaguar, but the jaguar sees human only as prey when he's hungry. When he's not hungry, so we have the emotion of the body, then he sees humans. You see that? This is by Babina Lambos and me on the topic of the Humboldt Forum, where we have a sound installation. It's still ongoing on the second floor. And the thing is, when the jaguar sees us human as prey, because he's hungry, then we can do something which is called a magic formula. It's called Taran. And this makes that the jaguar, we do this Taran, and we use the Pia name of the fire. A Pemon would be In normal language, it would be epoch berai. Epoch means fire, but in normal language, I would use a PR name for the fire to change the perspective of the jaguar. So when I use that and I use sound, in the end, I change the perspective of the jaguar. And this is transformation. I do not transform myself in a jaguar. I do not transform myself in fire, but the jaguar sees us as fire. So we transform ourselves in fire, not because we are fire, because the jaguar sees us as fire. So this is another kind of perspectivism. And what we do is we use a magic formula. We use formalized sound. And what I call indigenous sonorism, it's quite, it's not so serious when we call it perspectivism. We have to go into sound. Then we could say that sound defines the perspective of the other. It's a sound. So we have this in all magic formulas, and this is not only the voice. We do not have to speak these magic formulas. It's enough to think it, when we have the capacity to think this sentence I just told you, but please do not dismiss that. Do not talk about it anymore because it's some kind of sensitive data. And this is all like Terrain works, like all magic formula works. We have always one entity, which is a P entity, who affects the second one using a third one. So you have the hungry jaguar, we have the humans, and we have the PR fire, and we use, with our Terrain, we use this interiority to change the perspective of the jaguar. This is what I taught. So what we can say, the formula sounds defines the perspective of the seen world, beyond body or mind, nothing to do with not the one thing, not the other thing. What is Kanaima? Kanaima are human or some kind of hybrid entities between human and it's not a spirit, it's a human without a soul in the Kanaima state. And he prepares and kills other humans. This is very common in the Guyanas. There's a book by Whitehead called The Poetics of Violent Death. And here we have the situation that doing the act of killing, this entity, which is, it's a Primon, is perceived as a human person or a real human person, loses the interiority, its soul. So he's out of control. He's heating up. And he's killing as a monster. So this is kind of anti-shamanism because what is happening to restore its personhood, it needs to regain the soul. So here we have anthropophagy to regain the soul. He has 2 or 3 options. The first one is consuming the marble, which is more in British Guyana and like Cavallo and Patamona. Where Whitehead did research. In my case, this is the flesh of a human leg. Or, and this is the important point, he can sing a song. In this case, an Amanabui song. So I told you it's some kind of an anti-shamanic act because normally the shaman or the Piyasan is the one who controls the soul, and he controls also Kanaima in this way, but not always. But there are other entities called Kanaima who cannot control their soul. And so, and it goes out, they kill, and to restore it, they have to do this anthropophagy, really anthropophagy. This is not invention, not only word. You can substitute it by words, that's right. So here's one kind of song. I will not play the song. It's more complicated because in the moment when he's restoring his soul, he transforms himself into a mermaid, which is a lot of influences, but it's the first stage to receive or to re-become a human being by receiving the soul. So it has to do, and this is only a very short, I just told you I will make it short, thing that we go further with the next generation of anthropophagy, the next generation of indigenous perspectivism. This is Carlos Fausto. Carlos Fausto is a student of Roberto Castro, and the next generation of Fausto is Luis Costa, and they work about ownership and nurture because this is exactly what is the point right now. Things becoming complicated as Roberto Castro. We have these examples, becoming the other, or becoming myself due to the others, and singing the song. It is only between humans, but what is happening when other entities are involved? And so we have the Kanaima, and as I told you, why does it Kanaima kills? And he kills for plant spirit. Because the Maba Jews is prepared for the song and feeding the plant spirit. This is a feeding, and this was a good or it was a topic this in my forerunners that we have more nurturing and feeding as one fact, and the plant sphere is the owner as a relationship. It is not like slavery or whatever. It's the owner of a Canaima, and he needs to be feeded, and that's why the Canaima kills. And so the Canaima is something doing as a service to the plant, and as I told you, he's owned by the plant spirit. It goes any further, but this is just to give you some examples of this interaction between sound and anthropophagy. And in the end, I did some brief summaries. What is important for me when talking about indigenous sonorism, then we have formalized sound, but it can be syncing as well. You have to need the dong, or the ability to change the world, to transform the perceived world of the other. This is my idea of inter and trans-specific communication. It's more easier when we talk about interspecific communication, which means humans, like in the RVT case. It becomes more complicated when we have trans-specific communication. And it's rarely limited to only just two entities, as the Castro example we had. It is not only limited to perception, which is to see. Seeing is only one perception, but it's not the main one. We have an auditory, that's why symmetrically auditory anthropology, we have to concentrate also on sound. I'm an ethnomusicologist or anthropologist in music, that's why I work more on sound, but we have all the senses we have to include here. So we have a constitute. The only continuity we have is the transformation. We have always a different world we see. Just for what I understood is the topic that night, I do not think that material immaterial idea or binaries does play a role. Microorganism is not a size. It's more important that we can humanize. It's humanization. So indigenous ontologies, in my way, in my thinking, are very anthropocentric because we always interact with the other as seen as some kind of human perception with or without body. This was like we had in the beginning with Lewy Strauss, saying that they did the witch test of the white ones. It is important to. It's not important if the one is having a body or not, because if they don't have a body, then they are spirits, and this is what this experience means. Okay, this is everything, and the idea was to put that into discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Matthias. I'm just observing Klaus' scary eyes because of the timing and fear that we just have to go on at this point. And while the next speaker is waiting online, just a short introduction. And I will skip questions right here because we are really running late. Apologies for that. So if I'm understanding correctly, we have in line already waiting Sean Braune, is it correct? Yes.
Sean Braune, yeah, Sean Braune. Yeah.
That is correct. So Sean Braune is, as I said before, a important philosopher and filmmaker, but also currently a postdoctoral fellow at Brock University, and he has been a guest lecturer on experimental writing and storytelling at Yale University before. His book, Language Parasites of Phonontology, released in 2017, he's asking who speaks when one speaks and whether it is that I that one thinks oneself to be, that is that I, that self, while we can reflect on another kind of self that is no longer centralized on this agential inside, but maybe reconfigured as a result of the outside, the kind of language as parasite. So if I'm correct, you will tell us about notions of parasiting through language, and please welcome Sean Braune to this late hour here in the Angewandte Interdisciplinary Lab.
Hi everybody. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Klaus, for having me here as well. It's nice to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about eating books today, actually. So but it's going to overlap with parasitism, certainly. In Oswald Dandraja's Cannibalist Manifesto, he writes, quote, I asked a man what the law was. He answered that it was the guarantee of the exercise of possibility. That man was named Matthias. I ate him, unquote. Matthias comes from the French galimatia, which means confused, unintelligible speech or gibberish. The law as such for Andrade cannot hold, and it becomes the signifier of the breakdown of meaning. Instead of assisting in the aid of the structure of meaning or of sense, the law constructs its very opposite. This position points to the liberatory power of the non-meaningful, of the ways in which nonsense can assist in a movement of resistance or as a sign in a guerrilla approach to toppling a hegemonic power structure. Signs contain tremendous power, even when those signs convey a lack of meaning. This political importance is related to eating people. The solution for Andrade in response to Matthias is to eat him. This is a cannibal solution. My focus today is to think about this cannibal solution in relation to the eating of language and the idea of a parasitic and sonic unconscious, which is a lot to do in 10 minutes, but I'm going to give it a shot. In the book of Revelation, John of Patmos is told by an angel to eat a book, quote, take it and eat it up, unquote. The literal analysis would claim that John of Patmos somehow manages to eat the entire book, but the details of how John manages to choke the book down are rather slim. Like Charlie Chaplin in The Gold Rush, when Chaplin eats his shoe while prospecting for gold in Alaska, swirling his shoelace with a fork as if it were a succulent noodle. Or Werner Herzog, who rather infamously ate his own shoe publicly after carefully boiling it with garlic cloves and other spices, there are scarce details about how John goes about eating the book. The only explanation of the process appears in the short phrase, ate it up. In a literal interpretation, the absurdity of the process becomes one of specificity. How exactly does one go about eating a book? Do you first marinate the book for a few weeks in order to soften the binding and paper? Do you just choke it down with a nice Merlot? The symbolic interpretation of biblical book eating would read the passage metaphorically, in that eating becomes the equivalent of reading, in which the knowledge of the Bible becomes absorbed into the Christian adept's body. So much of Christianity is localized around the idea of bodily absorption. The body of the Christian absorbs the body of Christ during the Eucharist and the knowledge of the book during reading. This textual tradition can be found in a unique instance in the children's book, The Incredible Book-Eating Boy by Oliver Jeffers. And in the chat here, I put a little handout for those who are online, and it contains some of the quotes I'm talking about and some images from the Jeffers book. I'm going to hold the images up to the screen when I come to them. But in this text, a young boy named Henry realizes that eating books is easier than reading books, which I think a lot of people today would probably agree with, because he is able to, quite surprisingly, absorb the knowledge contained in books after eating them. And so here is figure one. So if you have the handout that I put in the chat, this is figure one. This is the boy eating a book in this work. This process continues for a while until Henry experiences a kind of delusional psychosis brought on by an excess of language. His abilities to communicate become disrupted by the volume of knowledge he contains. Essentially, speech begins to leak out of him as sound poetry when he tries to answer even the simplest of questions. And here he is. This is figure two. This is the boy filled with language, and the language leaks out of his mouth. Language seems to live inside him as a sort of parasitic other, as a kind of linguistic tapeworm that fastens to his neocortex and fills his mind with various signs and marks. Language spills out of the boy as his insatiable hunger for books overcomes him. Henry is filled with a parasitic form of noise. Noise is chaotic and nonlinear, while sound can be considered the ordered and linear variant of noise. If noise is chaotic, then what is it about a sound that makes it noisy? What is noise? Simon Reynolds writes that, quote, noise then occurs when language breaks down. Noise is a wordless state in which the very constitution of ourselves is in jeopardy. The pleasure of noise lies in the fact that the obliteration of meaning and identity is ecstasy. And this is because the root of ecstasy means, of course, being out of oneself, unquote. Gally Matthias enters the chat. Sound, like language, features normative formations that allow for the construction of an inclusivity as meaning and an excluded term as non-meaning or noise. Sound, unlike language, is often embodied, such as the humming of the body's nervous system. This humming, a sound that John Cage could hear along with his own heartbeat when he spent time in an anechoic chamber, a space that was supposed to surround him with silence, is an eerie remainder of the impossibility of silence, a remainder of silence's construction as a linguistic term. I am reminded here of when Steve Goodman writes in Sonic Warfare that, quote, radio engineers should be accompanied by a psychic engineer to aid in creating a mode of radio that communicates the unconscious, unquote. Lacan often insists that his focus is not on the patient's language per se, but on the sound of the patient's language. Sound is, for Lacan, closely associated with the real, what he calls the real. Quote, the place of the real, which stretches from the trauma to the fantasy, is what for us explains both the ambiguity of the function of awakening and of the function of the real in this awakening. The real may be represented by the accident, the noise, unquote. I insist that the real as noise empirically indicates a sonic unconscious. This sonic unconscious announces itself as real either as the sudden noise or as the silence, which is never silence in itself. It can also be announced as déjà entendu, which is the sense of having heard a sound before. Noise is ideologically disruptive, whereas sound is conceptually normative. How is this instance of book eating and the idea of a sonic unconscious related to the eating of man? Examples in the various canons of different discourses are related to the eating of anthropos. The very prefix of anthropology and anthropophagy is targeted in the eating of texts that precede the very construction of the category man or the construction of the category human that has been critiqued in the wake of posthumanism and anti-humanism. My purpose today has been to consider the sign itself, as something that is cannibalized or potentially cannibalized in a figurative way. The signifier and associated regimes of knowledge are fundamentally incorporated into the body in much the same way as human flesh can be incorporated in an act of cannibalism. This argument borrows from Maggie Kilgore's arguments for the ways in which cannibalism is a metaphor for incorporation. Extending this argument to the earlier references to the Gally Matthias figure from Andrade's manifesto, I would say that meaning as such is largely constructed according to bodily and embodied processes of incorporation. Levi Strauss called cannibalism, quote, an alimentary form of incest, unquote. And it is partly because cannibalism creates a tightly wound feedback loop. Cannibalism demonstrates a metaphorical or figurative mode of incorporation, but what is unsettling about it is that it is a mode of incorporation that is too literal. It is too material. It is close in form to what has been called the incarnational fallacy in the history of philosophy of language. It is a fundamental misrecognition of what should be only a metaphor. Therefore, anthropophagy pushes against a traditional structural and post-structural model that would emphasize the arbitrariness of the sign and points to an earlier incarnational semiotics, such as that found in Cratylus, for instance. And now I conclude, this is my conclusion. And here, at the conclusion, I return to the beginning with Galimatia and the gibberish mentioned in Andrade's manifesto. The speaker in the manifesto asked a man what the law was, and the man answered that it was the guarantee of the exercise of possibility, and this is spoken by a man named Gibberish. The apparent meaning that is unfixed in the arbitrariness of signification can be seemingly fixed in the experience of a semiotic anthropophagy, a linguistic mode of cannibalism that incorporates an earlier Enlightenment and even colonial notion of the human or of man, and consumes this earlier mode for the purposes of a new incorporation and integration, the formation of a new modality of the human. What I am trying to say, in short, is that there is a new human on the other side of the post-human. And it is by reconsidering Andrade's manifesto in light of our contemporary era that we can begin to imagine this new anthropology and even ontology. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sean, for these reflections. And I mean, there's a lot of resonances here to claim maybe to move from the metaphoric to the metabolic and to conceive of this cannibalism as a metaphor which in art practices, of course, beyond anthropology gets really rematerialized. And this is where the stream goes right now, because the next speaker, and without any further transitions, I will invite Theresa Schubert.
One question.
There's one question.
Sure, I have only one very simple question, which is eating books the reason why your book has only 100 pages? Did you think when you were printing or writing, did you think about that it is going to be eaten?
I think the dream of anyone who ever publishes a book is that someone will one day eat it. So, I mean, I would say I didn't consciously think of that, obviously, with the length of the book, but I mean, we can all dream to have our texts be eaten by our readers. So, yes.
Well, we have an example in this room of Thomas Feuerstein's work as well, of Hegel being eaten as well, and to be consumed in a certain way. So Hegel is probably much longer than this 100 pages, but this will be for our next talk, I guess. But again, moving from metaphorical to metabolical considerations, this is what's happening through the invention by Theresa Schubert, because Theresa Schubert, who is a Berlin-based artist, also with a PhD in media art from Bauhaus University in Weimar, involves organic systems, matter, living organisms, as well as algorithms and artificial intelligence in her work. But in the project that we are going to talk about this evening, mainly Meet Me, Theresa presents literally a kind of artistic practice of auto-anthropophagy and eating herself by growing meat from her own muscle cells after having taken biopsy under laboratory conditions, and then eating it, literally consuming herself, but also then engaging in sound and experiences, cloning her voice and initiating a dialogue between herself and her flesh-eating, her cannibalistic alter ego. So it's about metabols and metaphors at the same time, and about really engaging in rematerialized art practices. So Theresa, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jens. I'm happy to be here tonight. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see my full screen presentation?
Yes, it's fine.
Yes.
Yes, okay. So, yeah, I'll keep it very short, hopefully. So I'm talking about Meet Me, which is an artistic research project and a bioart project and performance. It originates from a question that is in the background of many of my works, actually. How can we misuse technologies to create more respectful relationships between all entities on our planet, be it living or artificial ones, with the aim to open up alternative visions, inspirations, and new spaces for thinking? So Meet Me, I developed between 2019 and 20. It culminated in a performance at Galleria Kapelica in Ljubljana. And it was a collaboration, with Kersnikova Institute and EduCell, a stem cell company from Ljubljana in Biotechna. As an artistic research project, Meet Me applies innovative biotechnological advancements beyond a scientific purpose or monetary intent. It engages with the urgent topic of food supply in times of meat mass production and its relevance not only for consciousness, but for our future on this planet. In the performance, I'm presenting the provocative notion of a biotech era cannibalism to raise awareness for issues around bioethics, body politics, and the inhumane treatment of animals in industrial farming. Through new in vitro meat production techniques, we could use our own body to feed ourselves. We could literally eat ourselves, yet stay alive. Many thinkers of posthumanism stress a non-human-centered perspective on the world, that we should assume a more modest role in our dealings with nature and stop hierarchizing species. For example, Braidotti says, in advanced capitalism, animals are disposable bodies traded in a global market of post-human exploitation. Further, the human body has also become an object of political debate and a contested arena for capitalization, thinking about medicine development and patents. The radical consequence that I have drawn is if we see the human as an animal, we should also be material and food. I demonstrated this through exploiting my own body as a ground for experimentation. This is, of course, a provocation, but it's not science fiction or some morbid dystopia. It's a possibility, at least technically. This is a video documentation of the project. Can you hear the sound?
I don't think we get the sound.
You don't hear the sound? That is a real pity. I'm going to share afterwards a link to the YouTube so that everybody who's interested can listen, watch the video documentation and also listen to the sounds then that are part of it. And I'm just gonna talk about over the pictures now. So the performance is a nearly 1 hour piece that I created from 3 parts. The first part is recreating the biopsy that was performed on my leg for taking the cell sample. But I'm also assuming the role of a butcher who's cutting up a larger piece of meat, not myself, but a piece of beef meat, imitating the same cuts than the surgeon did on my leg. And the second part of the performance, I'm staging an artificial dialogue between myself and my externalized self. And I'm using AI technologies in the first intent to create text responses, a text that were like I was feeding the AI system with questions with text of myself and getting the responses back, and then training a voice clone together with the sound artist Moises Horta Valenzuela, who also performs under the name of Hexosismos. And he created a voice clone of myself that was then giving the answers back on the stage. And in this second part, it's showing also video footage from the laboratory process and from the growth process and the preparation process of the cells, and how they were growing and the steps that were necessary to take. And the third part of the performance is the actual dinner, the preparation of the artificial grown meat in a fry pan, and then how I consume it at the end and cut it up. And also I shared it with audience, with people from the audience who wanted to try it. Some other sound aspects of the performance were that I was wearing a heartbeat sensor that was then spatialized in the space, and there was also microphones that were amplifying and altering the sounds that I was producing on the table while cutting up or frying the piece of meat and so on.
In a world where all life on Earth
So this is the part where you could actually hear my voice clone.
For nature, a truly wild world.
And the text that is typed out as an AI response.
Spirituality, self-determination.
At this part, we can hear the voice.
Oh, okay.
Until you look at the sky, we would all be better off without all of this. We hate Mother Nature. We hate. We only see the destruction of something as if it were some kind of tribute to ourselves. You don't have to look so hard to see that there's nothing we were doing or willing to sacrifice to save Mother Earth. Because we need freedom and love.
Well, I don't know what was wrong with the video before, that there was no sound. Maybe it was very large. So coming back to the sound aspect again, so there was these steps involved that there were first of all like me, my externalized part of my body growing in the cells, and a parallel in a way to the cloning of my voice and kind of connecting it to it. And on the one side, the voice was like a biometrical and a synthesized version of the body. And on the other side, it was the physicality of the cells that were actually present in the space and then consumed.
In a world where
also, what was a big part of the project is actually my idea of making the human vulnerable, which I also understand as a strategy for a more conscious dealing with nature and its living being at large. My idea of vulnerability here draws from post-human understandings of the body as an entity embedded in a nature-culture continuum, and therefore it's inherently open to change and not finished. This notion of vulnerability counters that of current neoliberalism that posits human integrity as a dogma or religion where the human is the ruler over all of nature. In doing so, the traditional religious and cultural integrity of the human body is perforated. It's literally opened up by a removal of human supremacy over other living beings. So I leave this for now and would be happy actually about some questions if there are any. And I will post the video in the chat.
Thanks a lot, Theresa. What strikes me as well is when you talk about the biopsy and eating yourself, that is in a little bit, I mean, I mentioned in the very introduction the piece by Tissue Culture and Art Project, The Disembodied Cuisine, the victimless steaks that we have been growing in 2003 in the exhibition in Nantes, but it was frog steaks, so to say. So, but when the Tissue Culture and Art Project talked about where the inspiration came from, it came from cannibalism, because one of their students actually proposed to grow victimless meat out of her own cells to make it self-cannibalism, but which never happened. So it was carried out on other bodies than human, and you put it back to the initial kind of motivation, so to say. So do you think that, first of all, it is more problematic to meet yourself than it's to meet others? And second, in how far the notion of the creation of artificiality in this breaking down of the nature-culture continuum contributes to the vulnerability that you're talking about, and how far is the sonic dimension of it, or like in other of your works, crucial, not to leave it to the image, to what can be transmitted. So is there a kind of visuality also in the sonic that goes beyond the image, beyond the metaphor, and is more visual?
Okay, so that was 3 questions. First of all, coming back to the first question, I think it's not more problematic to work with yourself than with others, at least not personally. I find that for me, because at least I know I have permission and ownership of myself. And whereas when doing this with others, this ethical question is much more prominent, especially with other living beings that you would like to consume or use in your experiments. About the sound aspect, is so this project is not originating from a sound research as such, but it plays an important part in the performance in the end. It's an element, an aesthetic element, an element of the dramaturgy. And it was also a way in my reflections to understand and reflect about how I actually feel about seeing myself exteriorized and growing in a petri dish, like my cells at least growing in a petri dish, to this bigger mass of meat cells, muscle cells. And sound was a method for me, how I could deal with it, and also how I could translate it to the audience in a way. And back then, when this was done, like the voice clone, that was late 2019. So you have to understand that the AI tools that were around back then were not as good, not as common as they are now, actually. So the voice clone that was done together with Moises Horta was still a bit glitchy and actually not perfect at all. It was quite clear that this was an artificial voice in a way, but I somehow liked also this rough and unperfect sound of it at the same way, because it fitted somehow to the artificiality of everything else that was going on in the project. And the other question I forgot.
Just one simple question I wanted to add, because we were talking a lot tonight about digestion, flatulence, and so my question would be, what was after you have eaten yourself? Is your how you have been digested by yourself, and did your feces change?
No, I think it was. We're talking about, you know, a small portion of this size and that such a thickness. So it probably too little actually as a mass to do any metabolic change.
I think you have eaten yourself also symbolically, and this is quite independent of the size of.
That is true, but I mean I could not realize any sort of bodily really changes in that way. Of course, it's a big emotional, spiritualistic experience somehow when you do something like that.
Thanks a lot, Theresa. I think this is also a very good transition, and maybe to have a look at what Svenja Kratz recorded for us. Svenja Kratz is also dealing with the topic of self and other and sonic dimensions of that, of course. We have a pre-recorded video from Svenja Kratz, who is an artist and researcher based in Hobart, Australia, and works also as a lecturer in interdisciplinary creative practice at the University of Tasmania. And her work is about Alice, which is a cell line derived from a patient in the 70s, an 11-year-old girl named Alice. And like other cell lines such as Henrietta Lacks or John Moore ones, this cell line is then incorporated in order to grow sculptures. In this case, it's also a sonic sculpture, a sonic bone sculpture. And so we have the sound aspect combined with BioMedia kind of growth in this piece that we are listening to now.
Hello everyone, my name is Svenja Kratz and I'm an Australian artist presenting from Lutruwita, Tasmania. Before we begin, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Muwinina people of Nipaluna Hobart, and the ongoing custodians, the Palawa people of Lutruwita. I pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all First Nations people joining us today. I would also like to thank organisers for the kind invitation to contribute to this discussion. It's been a privilege to revisit my 2008 work Bone Breath and consider it through the expanded lens of sonophagia or sound cannibalism. In this presentation, I'll discuss bone breath in the context of related work to examine how sound operates as a sonophagic force, ingesting and transforming one form into another as a means of signalling the complex interrelations between humans and more than human entities. To give you some context, bone breath emerged from my early engagement with cell and tissue culture, specifically working with the immortalised SARS-2 cell line. This cell line was established in 1973 from the bone cancer lesion of an 11-year-old girl I call Alice. These cells are available commercially through biotechnology distributors like the American Type Culture Collection and are globally and widely used in bone and cancer research. What makes these cells considered immortal is that, unlike healthy cells, they don't have a built-in stop mechanism to limit replication, which means they can reproduce almost indefinitely in the right conditions. As such, the total biomass of SARS-2 cells has now vastly outgrown the original mass of Alice's body. The production of vast quantities for commercial distribution and widespread scientific use also speaks to a broader ethical and cultural issue, the appropriation of bodies and biological materials for research and profit. These cells, once part of a body, have been commodified, replicated and distributed, raising questions about identity, ownership and the legacy of bodily materials that persist beyond the individual. In a sense, Alice's cells live on as separate entities. They remain deeply connected to Alice through her DNA, but they also embody the other, the disease that altered them, but also the mineral other, as osteoblasts, as bone-forming cells, continue to produce a mineralized matrix in culture. It is a process whereby biological matter becomes mineral, revealing the deep entanglements of living and non-living matter. The cells themselves also reveal a transformative openness. They are far from static, but rather change and adapt to different environmental and nutrient changes. Over 6 months, I split the SARS-2 cells 78 times, exposing them to varied conditions, resulting in visible changes from the low passage stocks typically used to ensure reproducibility in research. These cells, in their ability to continually replicate and change, exist as a form of embodied memory and emergent potential, a remnant of a past life persisting beyond absence or death, but also as a microscopic organism engaged in the process of continuous becoming. These initial observations inspired the creation of the Absence of Alice project that brought together a range of works that collectively explored the uncanny and dynamic nature of SARS-2 cells as living fragments of an absent body. 78 impressions of a single object, for example, consisted of 78 plaster impressions of a bone-like object. The object represented Alice's bone cancer, and the 78 impressions corresponded to the 78 times the cells were split during continuous culture. Each impression was different due to the angle and impression process, along with the change of the object from plaster residue adhering to its surface. This work is connected to fragments of a body in the process of becoming other, a sculpture composed of perspex panels with latex and SARS-2 cell casts derived from selected plaster impressions. Together, these pieces reflect on the impossibility of capturing a singular permanent representation of any entity, emphasizing that all organisms and elements are continuously engaged in processes of transformation. I mention these works because Bone Breath exists in a relational dialogue with them. It comprises a video animation where the original bone object has been scanned and transformed into a sequence of 3 expanding and contracting forms. Synchronized with the sound of a girl's breath, this piece evokes the isolation, multiplication, and dispersal of Alice's cells, drawing connections between presence, absence, and the proliferation of Alice's living cellular legacy. In Bone Breath, sound is more than just a medium. It operates as an immersive force that connects all elements in the space. The sound of breathing fills the room, devouring silence and suggesting a wider liveliness that includes the space, objects, and viewers. This breathing sound evokes a sense of Alice's ongoing vitality and extends her legacy beyond the visual. It serves as a means to animate and revive, reconstituting forms within an active relational space where Alice's absence is made present through the combination of sound and fragmented forms, suggesting a network of interrelated residues that operate across the living and non-living. Thinking with Monica Barker, breath itself resonates with all life forms that depend on respiration, framing air as a shared medium that connects and sustains us. In sonophagic terms, breath can be seen as consuming the environment and an extension of one's presence within a shared atmosphere. Each exhalation leaves an imprint, while each inhalation takes in remnants of what came before, embodying a cyclical process of continual exchange. Just as sonophagia challenges the idea of pure isolated sound, urging us to absorb and transform through others, Bone Breath invites us to see the self as a multi-species ecology with the multiple overlapping but connected lifespans. In this way, life and death become interconnected states of becoming rather than separate fixed categories. The visual and sonic elements of Bone Breath are further taken and reconstituted in the related work in process. Exhibited in an adjacent room, the work consists of 3 video animations displayed in plinths with circular openings, suggestive of a microscope view. The 2 outer screens show transformations of the original bone object into strange cell-like forms created from scans of latex casts from fragments of a body in the process of becoming other. Time-lapse footage of SARS-2 cells is also overlaid, while the central video shows cell division, suggesting the potential for continuous change and mutation. The audio of In Process layers the breathing sounds from Braune breath with a track derived from time-lapse footage of Alice's cells converted into sound using software for the visually impaired. By listening to the movement of cells, we participate in another form of sonophagia, where the process of listening becomes a form of ingestion, allowing us to have an encounter with a microscopic life form, and through the sound witness its liveliness and the persistence of life beyond conventional boundaries of life and death, self and other. As a mediated experience, In Process also reflects on the limitations of scientific and technological translations, converting cell signals into numerical data, capturing cell movements in time-lapse, or translating images into sound. These methods may give us some insight into cellular activity, but should be understood as abstractions. They don't just reveal biological phenomena, but they also transform them in the process. It is also important to note that the visual and sonic elements of Bone Breath and In Process have themselves not remained static, but fed into later works such as HEC 293T, The Transformation of Joni or Oliver, and SKLM Tumor Baby. By reusing and transforming audiovisual elements, these pieces bring Alice's story into relationship with other cell lines, such as the HEC human embryonic kidney cell line, and even my own cellular offspring. Sound here becomes a layered, evolving mechanism that weaves histories into a soundscape that links past and present and captures different connections across time. By devouring these cell lines and presenting them visually and sonically, we are reminded that our bodies and stories persist in ways we can't fully control or predict, forming part of an ongoing, entangled process of becoming. In conclusion, Bone Breath and In Process use sound as a transformative force, reanimating memory and immersing us in a presence that aims to transcend absence. Through sonophagia, a creative act of reconstitution that allows identities and voices, both human and non-human, to exist in fluid, evolving relationships, they challenge the boundaries of self and other, revealing our existence as part of an interconnected web of life, death, and becoming. By consuming and transforming forms, they invite us to reflect on self and mortality, reminding us that, like Alice's cells, our legacies resonate far beyond individual lives. Finally, I would also just like to thank the many people that have supported the projects discussed today. Thank you.
We cannot ask Svenja questions right now because it was a pre-recorded intervention. However, I can see a good transition to the last... Oh, she is there, okay. Good, perfect. Thanks for being so courageous then. Is there questions over here from the room? I have one. I remember when you first presented, I think the absence of Alice also at a conference, the Superhuman conference in Melbourne, there was quite a lot of people really not getting this kind of metonymic connection between the cell lines and the person, and the narrative being so strong that people had the impression that the cells were actually fed both to the ends and the sugar to the ends. So, and you played very much on this confusion between the extension of a kind of immortalized self, which is actually dead, and the current organism that is an artificially grown piece. Can you remember that episode, and how do you connect it to the addition of sound as a kind of what you called a soundscape, kind of listening to the cells, the respiration also as a way to incorporation of the milieu, this transspecies ecology, and the sound being its actual transmitter?
Thank you, Jens. Yes, I actually did feed the SARS-2 cells to ants. I mean, part of my work is really about this continuous transformation that occurs across species boundaries. And so, and that might happen within this, within a lab context, but also resonates outwards. So with a lot of my work, I approach it very much from this kind of similar approach where things kind of get taken in and reconstituted, retransformed, but very much within the context of my own work. So that's also where Alice's story becomes, one of those key connectors that transfers over into all of the work that has come since. So it sort of becomes quite complex because you have a lot of these elements that are all, for me, really deeply interconnected. So it's hard sometimes pulling out a single thread because they all sort of become part of this interwoven sort of fabric. And so Alice as a presence is still coming into my work now, even though my work has moved into actually establishing my own artist cell line. So I've created an iPSC, which is an induced pluripotent stem cell line. I've actually got 2 clones, SK1 and SK2. But for me, the story of those cells are interconnected with Alice's story, but also connected to all of the other cell lines. Like you mentioned, Henrietta Lacks, John Moore, it kind of becomes this interconnected space. And for me, the sound operates also within that, so that you have the breadth of the Alice work folding over into all of the subsequent works, so that it becomes a sonic connectivity as well. I hope that sort of answered your question.
Yeah, totally. I wonder whether this is a kind of new trend, a little way. I mean, because a lot of these artworks are conceptually based on authenticity, the authenticity of the actual cell line and not being whatever cell line. I mean, this is, I think, also the motivation for yourself to go on and to actually produce an own immortalized cell line. But the very act of making and growing it for real is important, while a lot of the processes are escaping our phenomenological scope, while it's microperformative activity. So we have a kind of need, a desire for actually maybe coping with this phenomena by something that is also gone beyond this lab aesthetics, what we saw a lot in the beginning of these art forms, where we had dramatized showcases in the dark and having a kind of focused attention, but which mostly was visual. And the storytelling going beyond, the storytelling relying on what actually viewers had to believe because they couldn't see. We saw this also in Theresa's work about the inclusion of sound, and we saw it recently also in the piece that Nazor from Symbiotica and Chris Salter produced about labor, also producing a kind of atmosphere to actually provoke co-corporality with the user, and you do this through breathing as well. So do you think that sound is a kind of feature that in our realm of biomedia art is explored more and more also in order to prompt this kind of co-corporality with the viewer and the participant?
Absolutely. I think sound becomes, as I was sort of trying to say, a mode of being able to connect someone into a particular viewing space. So within all of the works, even a recent work, which was Morning Story, I had a sound that was playing throughout the whole space that again included elements from previous exhibitions, but was about setting up a particular sort of embodied presence within the space that helped also beyond just a kind of visual aesthetic to set someone into a particular mode of viewing and a particular poetic mode of viewing, so that it was very much around creating an atmosphere and then also allowing the works to connect. So that's also where there was a soundscape that sometimes plays in the overall space, and then also moments where individual works will have their own soundscape. So again, there's this blending of a multitude of different voices within the space. And I think that sound in that capacity is a really, amazing sort of embodied connector for viewers coming into a space, into a narrative, and being able to sort of create that relational sort of resonance with the audience.
Yeah, Thanks a lot. I mean, this clarifies a lot. So thanks a lot for being with us at these hours. And we are having a perfect transition to the last speaker. I will just myself reduce myself to a kind of announcement in the end. But let's take online Tristam Vivian Adams, because you talked a lot about breath, and Tristam Vivian Adams is going to talk about this fatality of speech, that we cannot breathe and speak at the same time. So we are hearing an intervention about the syntactic and rhythmic demands of speech and also singing, that of course necessitates that somebody breathes. So singing and speaking cannot be carried out in parallel. And we are here, of course, addressing the issue of appropriation, and also appropriation in the capitalist and also cognitive capitalist sense of acceleration and accelerationism. And what is this talk about, as I understood, is also about semiocapitalism, the accelerating pace of what is the excess of speed of signifiers, when the act of speed or the speed of transmission that we have currently been coping with is increasing and measured in syllables per second. That has doubled, as I understand, over the last time. So Tristam Vivian Adams is a theorist and writer, and completed his PhD at Goldsmiths College. And he recently has published also his book Horrors of Voice with Palgrave Macmillan. And yeah, I think this is a perfect transition if you have listened to Svenja's presentation just before. So your floor is yours. Thanks for being with us now at the end.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me?
We all here? Yes.
Good, good. Okay, well, thank you very much to Laser Talks and to all the contributors. It's been a very thought-provoking evening, and thank you to Klaus in particular for organising. So I'm not going to touch on breath as directly as the introduction might lead you to believe, but I'm certainly going to focus on the effects of accelerating capitalism on speech. So I'm going to give you in very broad brushstrokes some of the moves I make in the article. It's quite a long article, and it does have quite a lot of content in it. But as I mentioned, I'm going to focus in particular on how capitalism affects speech, and my case in point is the vocal fry, and my framing is Berardi's two very important concepts of the infosphere and the psychosphere. So I want to start by just touching on something that should resonate, because it feels like a very universal concept, but also an overlooked concept in studies of voice. And that's how voice is a very precarious and very delicate operation. It's easily shaken, and voice reveals a lot about the speaker in the way that it might change from the expected voice. We all know the effect of alcohol on voice or nervousness. One might stammer, and we shouldn't forget that there can be deeper traumas affecting voice. Freud's first paper was aphasia, the interruption of speech. And so from there I moved through a number of psychoanalytical readings of what interruptions in speech or interruptions in voice mean. And I take a merry waltz through the big names of psychoanalysis, Freud, Lacan, and folks in particular in the Slovenian school, like Žižek and Mladen Dolar. And this is all a framing to understand that language is a violence upon the organism. It's a psychoanalytical concept, and it goes back to Freud. But the effects of language on the psyche, on having to put names to things, is part and parcel in many ways of what would have been called, what Freud called the castration complex, for all its gendered problematics. So the central conceit of this paper is is the vocal fry, the croak when speaking, vocal fry. In recent years, perhaps given far too much attention by way of Kim Kardashian, but that's the sort of vocality I'm discussing. So I'm pitching this vocal fry really as a vocal interruption that is a consequence of being exposed to accelerating speech, accelerating information, being exposed to what Franco Berardi would call the semioblitz, a blitz of semiotic information overload. So here I'm going to focus in particular on some notions that Berardi posits in Precarious Rhapsody, at once very insightful and profound and also very energetic. It's a wonderful book. The framing of accelerating information and its effects upon the organism are two important concepts: infosphere and psychosphere. The infosphere is media. It's what we're exposed to. It's the content we could have access to. And for all intents and purposes, it's infinite, or it's always exploding like the universe. There's far too much. Whereas psychosphere is finite. We're organisms. We only have so much ability to absorb something affectively, emotionally, intellectually, subconsciously, and so on and so forth. These two concepts are always mirrored by Berardi in a number of different ways, with the concepts of cyberspace and cyber time. And the logic is very similar. Cyberspace is for all intents and purposes infinite, whereas cyber time is finite. None of us have a Bernard's watch where we can stop time and have a few extra hours in the day. There's only 24. So being exposed to this semioblitz of capitalism, what does this mean? Well, I turn to American comedies for a sort of proposition in this paper. Comedies like Gilmore Girls or Frasier or Friends have all had the speech artificially accelerated in the service of capitalism. A number of American television stations broadcast Frasier with the speed sped up, as if Niles needed to go any faster, and that was so that the ad break could be longer, so that they could have more advertisements in a given time slot. So Frasier went faster, and the adverts, you had one or two more adverts. I think this is a really important example to draw out, because on the one hand, for me, as I read Berardi, this is an example of the accelerating semioblitz of capitalism, that we're bombarded with more information daily. Life feels like it's getting faster. But on the other hand, they're in a microcosm. They're examples of what capitalism does to human organism. And I want to focus in particular in a quote from Berardi. It's a quote of Robin. And I'll read it now. Richard Robin. Evidence suggests that globalization has produced faster speech emission rates in areas of the world where the Western mode of transmission of signs has come to replace traditional and authoritarian ones. For instance, in the ex-Soviet Union, speed of transmission measured in syllables per second has almost doubled since the fall of the communist regime, from 3 to almost 6 syllables per second. Similar findings reach the same conclusions in the Middle East and China. So I don't want to lean too heavily on one study, but this brings me back to the vocal fry and my conceit that perhaps is the vocal fry, because it is, and it has been in recent years, contextualized as a particularly capitalist and American affectation. Is it perhaps the sound of the human buffering under the weight of being bombarded by this semioblitz Brady talks about? And I think that's been about 10 minutes. So I'll close it there.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Tristam, also for trying to be on time and to keep time at this very lately hour. So I see some parallels also with regards to works that we have been discussing, also with Klaus and Emanuel's work, with the former project that was called microbial keywording. We also discussed what, for example, the standardization of language could mean, if even this might affect the biodiversity in the mouth ecology, when everybody speaks airport English or academic English is speeding up semiocapitalism by 5. And just let's imagine this Swiss guy speaking 3 times slower. And I mean, we have this acceleration that we also, I think everybody is experiencing, and how far this not only affects bodies in terms of speeding them up, but also in how far it may change also the pH level and so on, because we are all losing different ways of speaking while adopting to this kind of standardization. I don't know if Klaus or Emanuel want to hook up on that, because there's an obvious link.
Just one question. I mean, there is an amount of science and an acceleration. These are quite two different things, because one, the first one is related to semiopollution, and the second one, or how the relation between the both. I mean, because if the amount of science you're confronted with are bigger, you have to possibly accelerate to cope with them. Yeah.
So I suppose I don't, for me, an important question is not the amount of signs, but rather the frequency and the intensity of signs. I mean, when one talks about signs and semiotics, we're not just talking about text. We can talk about images or sounds that have obvious cultural value and meaning. You know, the world is semiotic in that sense. And so I think the question is not how many, but what duration, for how long in the day, at what intensity. Because I think if we're talking about sound and visual semiotics, we need to talk about intensity too. Certain sights and sounds excite the organism, stress the organism, however you want to pass it out, more than others. So I think frequency, duration, and intensity are important questions in terms of the metrics around the semioblitz, as Franco Berardi would call it.
Okay, we're talking about acceleration, so I think we have to accelerate. This is why also I will cut my own presentation very short. I was also supposed to reflect on notions of individuality towards collectivism and about self and otherness. I will be doing this very shortly, because we are having here an opportunity to be in this space where actually the exhibition that both Klaus, Emanuel, and other artists in this room have been part of, Holo Beyond Life is Other, was happening here, especially in this very nice Postsparkasse 2 years ago. And the book and the catalog coming out of this experience, including the experiments by Emanuel and Klaus and others, Thomas Feuerstein also being here, has been released right now, and the book just arrived on that table. So it would be just wasting the opportunity not to actually address this issue, because this book, Life is Other, Abiotic Entanglements in Art and Curating, very clearly, I mean, espouses issues that we have been currently also hearing in Svenja Kratz's incorporation of the milieu as a kind of including of abiotic factors, the breathing, the atmosphere we breathe as being part of us and the other not being separate anymore, but actually the same thing. So the dualistic distinction between self and other is something I would like to address very briefly through this book that is just being released, I would say, today. It's not available commercially already still, but I will have some slides. Actually, the book is called Life is Other, but you see that it's written with a V and an F at the same time, because life can be written in two ways, and we have been first writing it as live with a V, which is mostly the digital mode of transmitting something live, and live especially when we have been affected by the virus and by COVID-19 and not being able to present an exhibition with actually alive pieces. We had to have them downloaded live, so the very modality of live transmission is embodied in this very first version, when live with a V, then further moved with a live to an F, here at the Angewandte Interdisciplinary Lab, using for the first time also both galleries that have just been renovated. And HoloWind Life is Other is therefore raising the questions of what is identity, what is individuality, what is difference, what is cohabitation, what is entanglement. And based on the contributions of this book, I will just draw some very short conclusions here. So we had been displaying this as a wall, kind of mural, the special issues on microperformativity co-edited with Lucy Strecker has been printed large, so also that visitors could climb up and down on ladders, lay down the floor, rob, crawl in order to encounter microperformative encounters in the real space, as we can see here. Also, the transmediality of the project was important. We addressed this even in the last intervention, that media is this large space which opens up possibilities, while the actual kind of co-corporality and engagement with bodily interaction is actually finite. And we have here a model of the meta kind of digital visit that is also contrasted with a kind of very finite kind of visit in the space. Here, for example, commenting like you do with a like, a digital like, transposing the digital like into kind of microbial like, when we ask people in these installations to speak into what looked like a microphone but actually is kind of recording device that records your own microbiota in a petri dish. So we were addressing the questions of who and what actually micro-performs today, and taking the very notion of performance to that of performativity. Performance being, of course, something that a mostly human entity does in front of an audience as in a kind of aesthetic experience, and performativity as being something that is inherent also in non-human kind of agencies, and shifting the questions to what performance and performative practice with non-human agencies distinguishes. And we had also only compiled here a large scope of actors, micro-performative actors that were appearing through the 44 contributions to this special issue. This question of self and other is relevant even when it comes to plants. For example, a plant can measure the presence of other plants and therefore adopt growth patterns. For example, you can simulate this with green foil, and the green foil would simulate, while the very green frequencies of a plant is not significant in terms of photosynthesis and energy gain, but it would simulate another presence of another plant, and therefore growth patterns might change according to the presence of other plants. So we have also here measuring the other through a kind of collective or individual experience, which is also something that we find in quorum sensing, when actually bacteria sense molecules, autoinducers in their concentration inside or outside this membrane, this boundary, which is very flexible. And it's about the concentration of what is inside and outside that the self is being defined. It's not a kind of ontological differentiation, what is very different inside and outside, it's a concentration. So all these questions of individuation, of course, pop up in discourses when it comes to this scale on which individuation happens. And of course, we have this holistic view of an organism as a complex functional space-time systems based on biochemical function systems, enzymes, metabolic products, and going up to multicellularity differentiation, to tissues, sensory organs, orientation, prey, capture, reproduction, ecological, social functions, and so on. And at each level, you have a kind of individuation where you have a distinction between self and other. In a more biological-centered approach, such as by Gilbert Simondon, individuals in the philosophical sense are either considered to be ontologically indivisible, but they became by the way that the living modifies its relation to the environment. So it's not that ontological, there is something indivisible, which is where the notion of individuality comes from, that it's about becoming indivisible. So the living itself in its process is an activity of continuous individuation. It's a result of individuation, and it's rather a theater of individuation, and it's kind of reversed ontogenesis. And this brought up to this understanding put forward by the term of the holobeyond, in terms that Lynn Margulis coined since 1991 in her book Symbiosis as a Source of Evolutionary Innovation, to define this theory of symbiosis linked to miniature ecosystems. And there are some very known examples, such as these eukaryotic organisms that are holobeyonds, and most people know these two cases, for example, the mitochondria that are enclosed prokaryotic organism that serve as power stations in our eukaryotic cells, and the chloroplast in the case of the plant that's also enclosed former kind of prokaryotic cells enclosed in eukaryotic plant cells. So we have been dealing with this idea of the holobeyond, life is other, so that actually destabilizes this very dualistic approach between self and other that has been very much also in the center of this evening today. And it's a very different understanding than the famous Je et un autre by Arthur Rimbaud in this 19th century declaration, I is another, which has been also interpreted through various lenses, including Lacanian psychoanalysis, since it addresses this kind of fragmented self. It suggests that there's another kind of creative impulse to be imputed to psychological splits and other external forces beyond the artist's genius and cognitive control. However, today this other tends to be even physiologically explainable, and indeed based on the natural science addressed in terms of multi-species alliances. So for example, and we have an article by Dorian Sagan, Lynn Margulis' son, and also Carl Sagan's son, and long-term collaborator in our book, when he writes, consciousness, my I-ness, is just the job that the consciousness of my 90% bacterial cells and the obligate 10% animal multicellular cells require me to do. In other words, our planet mates, the others whose space we share and whose shared are what we are. And taking this argument even further to the origins of humans' sensory systems, media philosopher Bruce Clark argues that what has evolved over time into today's nerve cells, allowing for perception, thought, speculation, and memory, are nothing else than the large-scale manifestations of the small-scale community ecology that is a fusion of two ancient forms of bacteria. So basically saying that prokaryotic cells are the origins of nerve cells, and having a more kind of evolutionary perspective on that. So it's just an overview about what the book is about, and we are certainly having other events here at the Angewandte Interdisciplinary Lab, I would say, in the future, and trying to bring this book a little bit more to the focus of attention. This chapter is by Klaus Spiess, and it's actually about the piece that I've just been mentioning, and it's the precursor of the project that Klaus and Emanuel has always been staging. This piece, of course, was on the spot here, just at this gallery. That is nice to remember that we had the actual performative process here, right 20 meters from here. In this piece, I curated with artist Maja Smreka from Slovenia. It's about the hormonal kind of communication between a dog and a human animal, and breastfeeding and raising adopted puppy. Here, Maja Smreka works on the interaction between two different hormones, which are enabling her to experience motherhood, but without reproduction, and mother and otherhood combined in a kind of trans-species creation of a future family. So, just flicking through this very quickly, I want to choose just this image where the self is the other in the very different sense. We had this very impressive table by Bruce Clark, Lynn Margulis herself, and Doreen Sagan, in which they have this holobiontic representation of a planet at a planetary space. And for this exhibition, both in Bregenz and here at the Angewandte Interdisciplinary Lab, they have contributed this artistic rendering of Margulis' theories, comprising a particularly striking example of the holobiont, by which I would like to finish this evening, because it tells a story between self and others. And I'm speaking of this case of endiosymbiosis of this Hawaiian bobtail squid, which is home to the bioluminescent bacteria Vibrio fischeri, and feeds them sugars and amino acids, while the latter become a special light organ in the squid's mantle. A very interesting case that Lynn Margulis has been writing about a lot. And by this symbiosis, the squid can match the ambient light of the night sky and hide the squid's silhouette when viewed from below, and this counter-illumination protects it from predators. So could there be a more romantic story of symbiotic entanglement than that of a marine animal escaping its predators in the moonshine thanks to prokaryotic othernets in its belly? So for my part, this is the end of my story today. I will invite you to have a look at the book that is just right out here, and hopefully more to come soon in this very nice house, welcoming us again this evening. Thanks. Klaus, any concluding remarks?
I hope we see you at the bar here with a glass of wine and the famous Angewandte curry.
That's it. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining. Thanks also for attending online. The hybridity doesn't allow for tele kind of transfusion, for metabolic teletransfusion yet, but you hopefully enjoy the curry and the wine remotely.